Hello. Hello, everyone. Sorry. Hi. um, so, welcome to all of you who are here and all of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel. My name is Chika Ofram, and I am the Director of Audience Development for American Experience. On behalf of our series, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. American Experience is television's longest running and most watched history series. For 35 years, we've been bringing to life the incredible characters and epic stories that have shaped America's past and present. It is our mission to highlight all the experiences that make up our national story, the good and the bad, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the challenging and the transformative. Stories like the ones we'll be examining tonight can be hard history, but at American Experience, we believe that by reflecting on the events of our past, we can better understand where we are today and how we move forward tomorrow. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our longtime corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Chasing the Dream, a public media initiative from the WNET Group, the Better Angels Society, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, PBS, and in a special way, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for their support of our series and for making tonight's program possible. 69 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the separate but equal approach to educating white and Black students was not only unequal, but unconstitutional. The 1954 case was supposed to put an end to segregated schools and put Black children on a path to educational equity. But for decades afterwards, Black families continued to struggle to secure quality education for their children, not just in the South, but in communities across the country. It took sustained activism on the part of Black families and their allies, along with numerous additional court rulings, for schools to be finally integrated. And while we've achieved the overall goal of school desegregation, there are open questions whether educational equity has been or can be realized. This season, American Experience examined the mixed legacy of school desegregation in two powerful films. The Busing Battleground, produced by Sharon Grimberg and Cindy Radine, which chronicles the decade-long struggle to integrate Boston's public schools, and The Harvest, Integrating Mississippi Schools, produced by Douglas A. Blackman and Sam Pollard, which tells the story of Doug and his classmates, the first fully integrated class in Leland, Mississippi, to attend all 12 grades together, beginning in 1970. In tonight's program, we'll look at extended excerpts from both films, comparing the persisting issues both communities faced on the road to integration, and reflecting on what these struggles meant for our country, then and today. I'm pleased to have our filmmakers for both films here tonight to help break open this history, and to have the NAACP's Dr. Ivory Toldson to lead us in conversation. I'll share more about each of our panelists in just a few minutes, but first I'd like to set the stage for this conversation by showing the opening scenes from The Busing Battleground, followed by The Harvest. Some of what you'll hear and see tonight in the clips we share include language and interactions that most of us are uncomfortable with today. But hopefully, in the context of the reflections of our living witnesses, historians, and experts featured in both films, they'll offer a fuller picture of the efforts to desegregate public schools in America. And now, let's take a look at the opening scenes from The Busing Battleground, followed by The Harvest.
You have one shot at raising your children. You don't get do-overs. We were very, very concerned that our children get a good education.
Growing up in Leland and thinking about where I lived, it seemed somewhat like a Mayberry to me. It was a very tight-knit community. People knew each other. People really cared about each other.
I grew up kind of a latchkey kid and had the run of the town, basically. I felt like growing up that the whole thing belonged to me and I could go anywhere and do just about anything that I could get away with.
Certain places, we couldn't visit. I mean, just like this park, for instance, this park was off limits, to blacks.
Leland was divided. You had Black Dog, where I grew up in, you had the white section.
There was always a railroad track. There was always a creek. There was always a road. There was always some marker that divided the neighborhoods.
In 1969, my hometown of Leland, Mississippi, finally had to reckon with something it had been avoiding for years.
In 1954, the Supreme Court made school integration the law of the land, a law to be implemented with all deliberate speed. Last fall, the court ruled that after 15 years, deliberation should end, and speed meant now.
Quality public education in a great portion of our state has been made an impossibility under conditions inflicted on our public schools by a vindictive, autocratic, arbitrary Supreme Court.
All blacks that was involved was nervous about it because we didn't know what was going to happen next, but we were still trying to do what we felt like was right.
The only thing I can see that it's leading to is destruction of our school system.
The Negro children, on a whole, are further behind in their studies than our children.
We've got a psychology running in the state which is very deeply negative about the possibilities of black and white working this thing out together. Because of it, we've managed to stay 50th or 48th for a mighty long time, while we're so busy holding one down and keeping the other just on top.
What are your thoughts about going to school with about half and half white and black students?
I don't care. I mean, the same people. I think we all should be together, and I hope that we could get along together.
My class was the first in Mississippi to have black kids and white kids in school together, from the first day of first grade to high school graduation. We were supposed to be the seeds of a great harvest of racial harmony. 3 decades later, I needed to understand what happened and why America is still so divided, even after all we went through. I went back to find out.
The first day of school, my brother and I had bus assignments, and we collected students and other buses to drive up to South Boston High School.
Your old street annex right over here, first 2 buses, please.
I went up to Southie High. There was staging for the television cameras, and the first one I noticed was the BBC. We all knew something was going to happen.
As the kids were getting out the buses, there was a line of police holding back residents from South Boston, screaming at the black students. We were fearful for our lives.
We were not pushing for desegregation because of the Brotherhood of Man concept. Where there were white students, that's where the money went.
How adults in Boston could not have come up with a better plan, it still baffles me.
I'm not for all this. I don't care. My one will not go to school, but it's chairman number 5. I
wouldn't care if they were green or purple. It's the idea of putting my kid on a bus when I have a school right across the street from where they should go.
White families and even some black families felt that the decision of where their children should go to school should be up to them.
First of all, busing will never work in this city. Never. They will not take the rights away from these people.
Many black parents were saying, this is crazy. No, we can't send our kids into the lion's den.
I don't want to bus my child to any school. I want to have a good school in my community where my child can go and get just as much good education as anybody else.
The battle over busing in Boston exposed an important truth, that the majority of white Americans didn't actually support civil rights if it meant they had to actually address racial inequality in their own cities.
The people of Boston elected people to public office who campaigned on deliberately racist platforms.
If you ask me, you know where I stand. You know where I stand.
Shoot all the niggas. Why? Because why should they come over here and wreck the city?
It was the ugliest that I've ever experienced human nature, and the most fraught with danger and concern that we were at the precipice of anarchy, civil war, a race riot.
It's not a question of whether the Constitution can be enforced. It's only a question of at what cost.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you our esteemed panel for this evening's conversation. We'll start with our moderator. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Ivory Tolson. He is the National Director of Education, Innovation, and Research for the NAACP, Professor of Counseling Psychology at Howard University, and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Negro Education. Sharon Grimberg is the writer, producer, and director of the Busing Battleground. She has a long history with American Experience, having overseen the production of We Shall Remain and The Abolitionists while on staff as senior producer, and as an independent filmmaker, produced The Circus and most recently, McCarthy for us. Cindy Radine produced and directed the Busing Battleground with Sharon. In addition to our film Freedom Summer, some of Cindy's producer credits include Tell Them We Are Rising, the story of Black colleges and universities, and the first episode of MSNBC's Obama series. Douglas A. Blackman is the writer and producer of The Harvest, Integrating Mississippi Schools. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist. His first book, Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009 and was produced as a documentary for PBS. His co-producer on this film, Sam Pollard, is unable to be with us tonight. Dr. Tolson, it's my pleasure to pass the baton on to you.
All right, good evening. Can you all hear me okay? Is the mic on? Oh, good. Yeah, well, I want to first thank PBS for bringing us together, and second, thank you all for these documentaries. They were very powerful, and I think all of us looked at it through our own lens and perspective. One thing that we all have in common is that we've all gone to school, and all of us can think about how our schools compare to the schools that you all went to, which will have some similarities, but also lots of differences because of the time. I also looked at it from the vantage point of being the National Director of Education for the NAACP, where we deal with all these civil rights issues today. And looking at your films, I saw the genesis of a lot of the things that we're still working on today. So I wanted to begin with the question of the timing in which you released these films. What do you all think about where we are right now, or your own perspective of why this might be the right time to digest these very powerful stories? Why don't we start with you, Sharon?
Well, in the case of our film, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the desegregation of the Boston Public Schools, so that's a really big moment to look back at what happened? What was the goals of that black education movement that led to the desegregation of the public schools, and why? What happened? What went wrong? I also think that Boston itself has been struggling with its schools. It almost lost the city almost lost the schools to the state in the last couple of years, and so there are still tremendous questions of equity in Boston, as there are throughout the country, shaped by what happened 50 years ago.
Yeah. What about you, Sydney?
As I was working on this film, one of the things that, actually I hope people take away from our film is that, with all the violence that happened around desegregation in Boston, the violence was not inevitable. And I think sometimes I think when people see this story, it's thought that, oh yes, it would end in violence, but there had been this long, decades-long struggle for school equity, and there had been years and years of opportunity to improve the schools, to have cross-community dialogue, and it just didn't happen. So, I don't know, for me, the film, I know the resonance today is, there's all these opportunities, and people should really take advantage and not, wait 30 years later to do something.
Yeah. One of the things I find fascinating is, and you talked about, state takeover of, potential state takeover of the school system. I know that in Mississippi, they're dealing with that too. And it's interesting that there's a dialogue around this federal encroachment on, the states' rights, get out of our education. But then the states will turn around and do it to a district what they don't want from the federal government. Oftentimes when the district are doing things that they should be doing are just a resource and equity. So wanted you to take the same question, Doug, in terms of relating that to the situation today, just from your own vantage point.
Sure. Well, one of the interesting things about that is that in the town of Leland, Mississippi, the schools we focused on at the beginning of the project, they were on the verge of being taken over by the state. They were under threat of that, and that was part of what catalyzed a period of great turmoil that was when we sort of started the film. By the time we got to the end of the project, it's become a kind of model of improvements in the public schools in Mississippi, whatever that might mean. But I think there's a bigger contemporary importance to all of this, and it definitely fueled my interest in making the film, is that the failure of public school integration, and I think it's the only thing you can call it, public school integration, despite the tremendous efforts that have gone into it, heroic efforts that have gone into it, has been a failure. There's some exceptions here and there, but only in places where it was much easier. And there's been a lot of bravery, but almost no success. It's a failure. Our society has refused to abandon an apartheid concept of public education, and that failure, I believe, is at the center of why our society remains so fragile in terms of race, and that everybody here tonight and watching most likely lives a life that's extraordinarily diverse compared to 40 or 50 years ago, and they work with people of another race. They may love someone of another race, live in a community that has multiple races to it. I mean, an unthinkable set of things for Boston or Leland, Mississippi in 1965. We're living those lives, but our town, our cities, our country may explode over race at any moment. It's this paradox, and I think the failure of public integration, public school integration, is at the core of that. It's the great missed opportunity of our era, and now we're also in a period where public schools themselves are under assault in general. So those were the driving ideas behind the timing for me.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me about both of the films is that it was really the adults that was messing everything up, right? If the adults told the children, this is a change that is necessary, and it's a change that will make our society better, it seemed, the children were ready to accept that. So what do you think I guess, what do you think about that? That we had so many adults that were steering children wrong, and what might that mean for how adults should be including children into conversations now about how to make our schools better?
Well, I was really struck because you have in your film almost exactly the same comment as in our film, which is, it's going to be okay if the grown-ups just stay out of it. And I think that was true. I mean, the grown-ups really set a terrible example for the kids and made it impossible for them, and made it completely impossible for them to get a good education. And so what happened ultimately is that that even parents who were leaning into trying to make it work pulled their kids from the schools because there was such chaos in the schools. So I do think that there's this wonderful picture that's at the end of our film where the kid, that's black and white photograph of white and black kids together on a playground. And I do think that the grown-ups need to step back and allow things to happen and to lean into it. I think that it was very hard in parts of Boston to lean into it because there was so much opposition from some sections of the adult community.
Yeah. So I wanted to look at another clip. So we're going to go into our clip 2, and this clip is going to be from The Harvest, and it's called White Evasion, Black Resistance.
When I came to Leland in 1953, the building that the elementary students were in was a wooden building.
I started first grade there. I doubt if there were 10 rooms in there, but it was one long hallway. On each side, there were your classrooms.
The textbooks had been used when they came over. They might have somebody's name in the front of them.
We didn't have a lot of materials and things like that, but we worked well with what we had. You had dedicated teachers, people who cared about the students and saw their needs, and this really helped them.
For most white people in Mississippi, making the changes ordered by the Supreme Court in 1954 was unimaginable or even repulsive. So instead of abolishing racially separate schools, Mississippi did exactly the opposite, launching an aggressive campaign to convince the rest of America that white and black people should remain separate forever, and began building and expanding even more segregated schools.
Since 1956, the state legislature has provided $80 million for school construction. 70% has been spent for colored schools and 30% for white schools. Each week for the past 3 years, we have completed an average of 3 new buildings or additions to buildings. Contracts have been awarded for over 5,000 classrooms, about 3,500 for colored children, and approximately 1,500 for white children.
Leland's all-white school board doubled down on segregation too, adding a new classroom wing, gymnasium, cafeteria, and library to the dilapidated school for African-American kids. And they named it, yes, after Abraham Lincoln. An aerial photograph of Leland's black campus was added to the Mississippi history textbook used by almost every 9th grader in the state, including me 25 years later. The caption described it as a model for the education of black pupils. Nothing else changed for a decade. Black and white children still attended completely separate schools until 1965, when the federal government finally began pressuring Southern schools to obey the law. Leland adopted what was called a freedom of choice plan that supposedly allowed any family, regardless of race, to attend whichever school they chose.
My daughter, under freedom of choice, she went to the Leland High School in the 9th grade and integrated to school.
I hope you people have noticed
I thought by having these integrated schools that our kids would have an opportunity to have a better education. This is what I thought.
I was very much aware of freedom of choice and that I could have chosen to go to the white school. As a little girl, you know, I was very fair. And I remember talking to my mother and dad about I could go to the white school. I said, I would fit right in. And my mother said, you are going to Lincoln.
At that time, I was assistant principal of a black elementary school. Several black students went over there.
And how many white students chose to go to the black school?
None. Wasn't any white students over here. None.
In reality, freedom of choice was a ruse, designed to technically comply with federal law, but for all practical intents and purposes, still preserve segregation. No white family was ever going to choose the black school, and black parents knew there could be serious consequences if they sent their children to the all-white schools.
But a few black parents sent their children to the white school, even though you knew that you would have some animosity toward you.
That threat was real. As far back as the 1950s, the state of Mississippi established a sovereignty commission with private detectives and its own agents to spy on and harass anyone who supported the civil rights movement. They even hired a paid informant in Leland. And when local police heard that the town plumber, a black man named B.T. Grossley, had secretly formed a local chapter of the NAACP, they threatened that white customers would refuse to hire him and ruin his business. But there was one group of African Americans who had little to fear anymore. The families out at Strike City already had lost everything. They never got their homes or jobs back. They'd been harassed and terrorized. But still, they managed to build for themselves houses and a meeting hall. They received federal War on Poverty funds to open a Head Start program for preschoolers. Strike City became a hub of civil rights activism. The strikers even took their tents to the lawn of the U.S. Capitol. And in 1966, their leader, a former tractor driver named John Henry Sylvester, testified before Congress about the hardships and abuse in Mississippi. When freedom of choice finally opened up those first few seats in Leland's white schools, the families at Strike City were not intimidated.
Wow, a lot of heavy content just in that one clip. And a lot of things to process. I think it's aptly called Black resistance. And when you think about it, education from its very origin for Black people and the Black experience in this country has been an act of resistance. My grandfather's grandfather was taught to read and was educated as an enslaved man by his half-siblings. My grandfather opened up a branch of the NAACP at a time when it was illegal, and half of his children went to segregated schools, and the other half went to integrated schools, which he fought for. So Black people having to resist to get the kind of education that they need, that we need, has always been with us. And the reason why we have that resistance is because of the white evasion that we talked about and other acts. So I just want you to kind of give us your thoughts on this clip and how you think it fits into our present day challenges and into the larger story of Leland.
Well, part of what's interesting to me about that particular part of the film, and there are other sections that address this too, was that number one, it was very important to us when we were making the film that we not overlook the importance of segregated schools before integration, the segregated schools for African Americans. And that's this complicated element of the story of where the racially segregated system is, obviously immoral and indefensible, and had to be swept away. Yet there's also this very heroic story within the segregated schools of that Mrs. Scott, the principal, talked about, that even though they were underfunded, lots of the money intended for black schools was stolen by the white schools. Typically, that went on for generations. But even in the midst of all that, you had this very heroic performance by African American educators, nonetheless, and also those places that are a creation of white supremacy are also at the same time a place where African Americans act in leadership roles and have a kind of freedom that didn't exist outside those. So they were sanctuaries as well. And so then when you get to the point in time, and I was struck by, I see similar tones of this in Boston, where you finally get to this moment that the society is, at least some people in the society, are trying to do the right thing, but it's not clear to the active players what the right thing is. Even among African Americans, they don't want to be screwed anymore. They don't want to be treated in the way that they've been treated for 100 years. They've been the people most deserved, obviously, and they don't want that to continue, but they also have a tremendous bond with the schools that they have heroically made work in a fashion. And so they are, as in the course of the interviews that we did and listening to the voices of those people, like Mrs. Scott, they are as unclear and uncertain and in turmoil over what's going to happen next as the white people who are most resisting these changes. And that's where I think in all of this, there also was just this staggering failure of leadership for the whole country and then in all of these locales as well. That this thing is finally happening, that's driven by a series of Supreme Court decisions that finally climaxed at the end of the 1960s, and so there is this legal requirement that has to be met, but there's no real vision for what this next thing is going to be. And that just opens the way for evasion and for resistance that it's not clear where this is headed or which version of resistance should be the one that prevails, and the kind of chaos that sets in, and then the chaos itself becomes yet more basis for evasion on the part of white people. One of the striking things to me about all that, too, is that someone asked me recently, they actually sent to me a ChatGPT response where they had asked ChatGPT, what's the answer if a person says, if a white person says, well, I chose not to send my children to the newly integrated schools and instead to send them to a segregated, private, white supremacist school because I was fearful of the violence that my children might encounter in the public school, the integrated public school. And ChatGPT's answer back to that was a very ChatGPT-esque kind of thoughtful response of that, one should keep in mind that even though this may seem to be a difficult choice, it might still be of good service to society. Nonetheless, no one would expect a person to put their children in danger. Well, that's exactly the logic that we allowed ourselves to fall into. That there was that ultimately this revolution, this staggeringly complicated thing, that somehow it could happen in this gentle way, in the way that Dr. King imagined it in the second of the dreams in the I Have a Dream speech. It's all about if we just bring the children together, if we just put the babies together, the less complicated players, if we just put them in the same classrooms and let them grow up together, well, they'll sort of solve the problems for us complicated adults. And that was that's a true idea, but a naive one, and one that, and there was a failure nationally and a failure locally in both these places and many others for anyone to really realistically grapple with what are we really talking about here, what's really going to happen, and the tremendous effort and will that was necessary and that never presented itself.
Yeah. I'm very disappointed to hear that ChatGPT isn't more thoughtful in how they think about these very complex issues. One of my favorite parts of the documentary was Strike City. And Strike City was a story that I never knew of, and I grew up in Louisiana. But it almost reminded me of a modern day maroon colony, where they, resisted against oppression and took their fate in their own hands and really served as a model of what black people can do if they were abandoned, and they were very resilient in that. And I like the story of, telling that story in the documentary and the resistance that you face. Could you talk a little bit more about how you learned of Strike City and maybe some insights that may not be obvious in the documentary?
Well, one thing about the Strike City story is that we had some struggle actually getting it into the film. Both we as the producers really wrestled over how to bring it into the film. It was critical to me that it be, because I viscerally understood that even though it's, there's nothing directly, or very little directly about the public school story in the story of Strike City. In some respects, it's its own thing. A group of farm workers going on strike at about the time that I and my classmates are born, and then all the things that happen to them. So in some respects, it's its own film. It might one day be its own film. But is it really part of the education story? And the folks at American Experience asked that question too. We had interesting debates with them after this became an American Experience co-production. Does Strike City really belong in the story? And in the end, the proof is always in the making that it ultimately worked. But for me, the reason it was so important was the way that in this place that was the most totalitarian, racially totalitarian place in America, and where African Americans lived, even at that stage in the late 1960s, under the most active kind of threat, physical threat, if they attempted to alter the apartheid system. That in that world, that this group of African American farm workers, the poorest people, the people who appeared to have the least power, the least education, the absolute least resourced figures in the whole society, that they're the ones who ultimately rise up and do this just unimaginable thing, particularly in the eyes of not just white people, but almost all black people. Yeah. This incredibly revolutionary thing. And the way that then sets in motion, though, this capacity of others to realize, as you describe, that, okay, actually, there are things we can do, and there is agency that we have, and there are allies who are among us and who are us. And so it had a transformative thing. And how I learned about it, I still don't know, because as I say in the film, I think, that's something that no white adult in my childhood, at least as I recall things, would have ever talked about those events around a kid. That those were things, those were banished stories, essentially, even in my childhood. But somehow I think I must have just heard about it from kids at school who came from that place, and somehow that planted enough that I became curious about it. By the time I was in middle school, that I started poking around.
Yeah, and you exposed the legend. And Strike City is kind of similar to the Freedom Schools, in terms of why it happened and this idea of black empowerment in spite of white resistance. Did you all see that connection too, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely there. The Freedom Schools being this kind of setting up, which I think we're going to see a little clip, right?
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and play the clip first, so the audience knows who we're talking about.
Today, Boston witnessed the Stay Out for Freedom Day, the so-called boycott by Negro students of junior and senior high schools of Boston.
When the school committee refused to do anything to respond to the NAACP, the black community decided that they had to keep the pressure on and act. Reverend James Breeden had witnessed a school stay out in the South, and he suggested doing the same thing in Boston. Let's get
the black children to stay out of school for a day and to show that we represent a lot of people.
When the Stay Out of School for Freedom came, there was no question I was going to be there. I was coming out of a relatively poor family, but even as a child, I had aspirations to do better. I didn't tell my parents. Dad would be scared that that could impact him.
We identified locations where we set up freedom schools, and we filled them with music, with poetry, and with lessons, and with speakers who these young people would never have an opportunity to encounter. We helped to make the connection to the South. We helped them to understand that this freedom school was part of the civil rights movement.
Most of you came here because you understood that here in Boston, you are deprived of your rights just as much as people in Birmingham are deprived of their rights. We've taken the first real step in Boston in beginning the struggle for our freedom here.
Bill Russell, the Boston Celtics, you gave a very powerful speech today at this Freedom Sit-In. Could you tell us what you feel is the success of this Freedom Stay Out?
The important thing is that we have taken the first step. And we have, as they say, thrown the gauntlet down, and we're into the fight now. And I think we'll win.
In November of 1963, there's a Boston School Committee election.
Louise Day Hicks is reelected to the school committee. She wins in a landslide. She sees that she's been rewarded for fighting against integration of schools.
Louise, early on, saw that a way of getting more votes and raising her political profile was to oppose these efforts at ending de facto segregation.
People in the Black community were frustrated that nothing was happening. They didn't win at the ballot box. They didn't get anywhere with the school committee. So 3 Black state legislators file racial imbalance bills to say that if a town or city had racially imbalanced schools, they would have to address it. Those bills went nowhere.
In February 1964, there's a second school stay out, and this one's much larger than the first one. This time, you have a number of students from suburban schools outside of Boston who come in and participate as well.
I was asked to organize students living in the suburbs to come join the stay out and to attend freedom schools and get to know kids from Boston and kids who were different from them in race and culture. And the response was amazing.
We have these 3 musicians this morning. We're able to integrate this room in 2 minutes. They merely said, you come down here and sit here, and you come there and sit there, and we were integrated, weren't we? I don't feel that this plan needs all that brains. I think it just needs some goodwill and some common sense.
Boston seems to be unique in the United States cities in that its school board, as far as we're able to learn, has refused to admit that de facto segregation exists in Boston and won't even talk about it. This is the oddest position that any city has taken in the United States.
We saw in 1963 and 1964 an extraordinary amount of energy being used to try to move the Boston public school system. Like you never saw before. It was fierce energy.
It's like a tsunami was sitting off the coast. And these different events that were happening, Ruth Batson at the school committee, the Stay Out for Freedom, picketing the school department, the sit-ins,
And so the school committee, every time something like this happened, they dug their heels in even more so. They acted in ways that provoked more action on our part because they would benefit from it.
Watch your head, Joe. All right, back it up. Oh, Joe. Open up now, open up, open up. Let's go.
What we must have is quality integrated education across the board, and we must have it in Boston. And I want you to know that I'm with you. I come here because you have come to us so often.
Martin Luther King was invited to come in April of 1965 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, which was his main organization.
Martin Luther King's visit kind of packed with meaning because he had been a student at Boston University. He had preached and given sermons at 12th Baptist Church. He met Coretta Scott King in Boston.
It was announced that there was going to be a march for freedom. We're going to meet and greet Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was our leader. He was the one that we were following.
All of my friends are there. These are people who had put their heart and soul into the activism during Boston's emerging civil rights movement, at a great risk to themselves. And here they were, being supported by this icon from out of town. It was thrilling to feel supported in that way. We walked singing freedom songs, and then at the Common, he gave one of his big speeches.
It would be demagogic and dishonest for me to say that Boston is a Birmingham, or to equate Massachusetts with Mississippi. But it would be morally irresponsible were I to remain blind to the threat to liberty, the denial of opportunity, and the crippling poverty that we face in some sections of this community.
All right, so Martin Luther King said that it would be dishonest to compare Massachusetts to Montgomery. I don't think it would be that dishonest, right? And he also said at the time that the racial disparities were urgent. And we see to this day that there's more de facto segregation in some of our larger cities up north than we see in the South right now. So I want you to just talk about some of your observations or some of your insights from that clip. We looked at Mississippi, we looked at Boston, so we see all of these parallels. And we also see a lot of connections to what's going on right now. Miss Louise sounds a whole lot like Mounds for Liberty, who's trying to ban books written by black scholars. They probably would ban these documentaries if they saw them. So give some of your observations and insights into what we've just observed.
Well, obviously, King comes up to Boston and he sees these terribly run-down schools in black neighborhoods, which are shocking. I mean, shocking in a city that has some of the best universities and colleges in the country, and shocking that exists in the North. And I think that the thing about Boston was that when the black community points out that there is de facto segregation in the schools, Boston's school committee won't even admit that. They won't even say, well, yeah, they won't even go so far to say it's nobody's fault exactly. So it was very entrenched because it wasn't de facto segregation. That's what the court case proved. The court case proves it was actually deliberately a policy of the school committee to keep the kids segregated. They went through enormous hoops and hurdles in order to do that. And so even though there were no statutes in Massachusetts that required black kids to go to one set of schools and white kids to go to another set of schools, in effect, that's what the school committee ensured, that white kids went to one set. And often white kids would go past black schools and go to their overcrowded white schools where they put trailers outside so that the white kids would not be going to school with black kids. So it was very deeply ingrained and also kind of unspoken about and hidden.
Sydney, you have anything to add to that?
I guess two things. When the black community brings King to Boston, it's this very deliberative move. They know that he's going to bring, media with him, and that all of a sudden, he's going to be shining this spotlight on Boston and calling Boston out. And they know that that's going to move some people in the legislature, not necessarily in city government, but at the state legislature to do something, because they're embarrassed. And he's challenging, the Boston liberal idea of itself, and how they're not like the South.
It's interesting though that you mentioned Moms for Liberty and that they might well want to ban these films. They don't really need to necessarily. I would venture that both of these films, it's already illegal to show them in a high school in Florida or a high school in Georgia or a number of other states. That these states that have passed laws that say that it's a crime now for a teacher to present information that might make some students uncomfortable. And I joke with students of mine at the university in Georgia where I teach, though I'm really not joking, but I jokingly say to them that they'll be assured of a very good grade in my classes if they can arrange it that to have because those laws exempt university professors, so you can show disturbing things at the university, but not at the high school level. And so I encourage my students to arrange it for a high school student to be visiting someday and in class when we can show some part of my film, and then if they can also get a state trooper to come and arrest me and record all of that, that they're guaranteed a good grade for the year. But I do think, also as the author of a book that has been banned from certain spaces, public spaces in Alabama and other places, I'm sensitive to this. But I do think that all of this really does get at the current struggle over let's not talk about things that are uncomfortable, and that's the same thing that white people in Boston didn't want to be confronted with a obvious need to confront the reality of their history and their contemporary times.
Well, they would say that all the agitation was black people from the South, that the black people in Boston, they're black people. They weren't causing any problems. That's what the initial pushback was. We didn't have any problems. It's outsiders coming in and creating the problems.
And the same thing was said in Leland about that, imagine this, imagine the white leadership in a community saying, all of this disruption, this lawsuit about the local schools is being brought by outsiders, being brought by the NAACP, right. And our black people that, are perfectly happy with all of this. That's the importance of that story of the plumber in our town, of that the reality that a black plumber or someone else with any level of independence, African American with any kind of economic independence, if they chose to go any further with that, to actually do the natural things of just standing up for the rights that they had, that they could expect to be confronted with, because it was such a violation of white expectations for African Americans to not. And it was such a shock to white people, an honest shock to white people, that they actually believed these things. They believed that the black people in Boston or the black people in this town, even in Mississippi, that they're perfectly happy with all of this. They believed that.
I don't know if Louise Day Hicks, who was on the school board, believed that the black people in Boston didn't want to make changes. I mean, they came to her meetings. She said it because I think politically it was advantageous to her. But I don't necessarily believe she believed it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that clip started with the Freedom Schools. How does that fit into the awareness that Boston had? And it was interesting that Boston were kind of driving these black people out of school. They were basically saying that we're not going to listen to you. We're going to pick your principals. We're not going to fix your facilities. And the teachers said, or the black community said, okay, we'll just start our own schools. And they're like, wait. You would think they would have said, like, okay, cool, go for it. So how does that fit into everything that happened?
Well, it's interesting because I think you're referring to the later time they set up there's one school. Right. There were literally no black principals in Boston. Very, very few black assistant principals. And the black community in 1968 started pushing really hard. And when they refused to hire a black principal, the parents at one particular school, which was really a terribly run-down school, said, okay, well, we're bringing our principal and we're coming to school. And they literally brought their principal into the school and set up a school. It was like a school within a school. And the following day, the authorities shut them out of the school. And so they took all of the kids and set up their own school and ran their own school on donations. A few of the teachers at the public school came with them, and they ran the school on donations and volunteer time and for 2 or 3 months. And the Boston School Committee pushed back really hard and threatened the parents with, they would lose their job. So there was a lot of pressure on the parents to bring their kids back to the school, even though, as you're right, they didn't really want to educate them. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and the Freedom School that they set up was kind of a model of what they had hoped they could have in the public school. So they were teaching the kids Black history and I don't know, about their roots, and they were giving books that had Black children, stories about Black children in it. I love that. I love that particular story in our film because it shows so much agency and sort of hope and vision, even though ultimately they lose that battle.
Yeah. But we still have freedom schools that exist today, and I think that there's a lot of inspiration from that act. There are some schools that have come up to fill these voids in public schools, and I think it also teaches a lot of parents that you don't just have to rely on the school to educate your child, and maybe not to trust the school 100% with your child's education, even if you choose a public school. So all of this is very fascinating. So we have one more clip that we want to show, and this is from The Harvest, and we're going to open up the conversation to all of y'all in the audience because there's so many cross connections, so you don't have to just respond to your own clip. So next one we're going to see is Working on the Ground from The Harvest.
How did you react to being around all these Black folks?
I had to do some fast learning. There were things that I had said all of my life, like calling my students boys and girls. But I began to realize that to my Black students, being called a boy, always being called a boy, was very offensive. I didn't want to offend my students. So I began to work at never calling them boys. I worked at not doing things that I knew were offensive. I am a teacher. I wanted my students to learn. And if my behavior kept them from learning, then I needed to do something about my behavior.
At first, I went through some challenges there with teachers. There were some teachers, going to other schools because they refused to work under me or with me. One in particular was something to deal with, let me tell you. I hated to see a school where one shade is up and one's half down. So I made an announcement. I said, please adjust your shades before leaving. She said she had been at that school, don't know how many years, I don't know how many years she said, but she said nobody ever told her to adjust her shades. I said, okay. I just said, okay. So in the evening when school was out, I'd walk down the hall, walk in her room, she'd be sitting at her desk, all the children would be gone. Hey, how you doing? Walk up to her window, adjust her shades, and walk out. I did that for 3 evenings straight. The 4th evening I walked in there, I never will forget. She said, you don't have to come in here and adjust my shades. I can adjust my shades. I said, oh, I don't mind it. I don't mind it at all. Since then, when I would get down there, her shades was adjusted and she was gone. I worked that out, me and the good Lord.
The faculties actually got along pretty well. The whites and the blacks, some of us became friends on down through the years. Teaching strategies, how do you do this? How do you teach this? And shared the ways that we could handle children. We didn't talk race too much. We just more or less talked people.
The way we were set up in school was they had A, B, C, D, all the way down to G and H as far as grouping children into classes.
Early in elementary school, we had to take a test and people were grouped afterwards.
That whole A, B, C group, the whole the connotation behind it, I starkly remember conversations with other black kids, black males, about the ability groups. Paul Chambers, and I'm trying to think, maybe Craig Rainey, and that's it. Only 3 African-American males in the A group, in a town that is, to say the least, chock full of African-American males.
The A section was mostly going to be your white students, but I was in the B section. The B section were mostly blacks, some white kids. So you kind of remember that, right?
Later in our elementary career, some of the African-American students got a real sense of that ABC group. And I left Leland as a 6th grader and went to Greenville because we had moved. And so I'm talking about 4th graders and 3rd graders who understood, oh, we are ability grouped, but this may not be fair.
I started out in 4th grade in C. You knew if you were in C, you're not as smart as the kids in 4B or 4A. You're not as good as the kids in 4B or 4A. And so you knew that, you were kind of, what's a C? A C is average. You knew that you were average. And it was kind of taken that way.
What we did at that time was to group by ability, after a test. The white parents who stayed with the school systems were kind of forward-thinking people, So naturally, their children were in pretty good shape. And so when they took those tests, it ended up with a lot of whites together. And so you still had, in a way, a sort of a segregation.
I decided that I'm not going to stay in 4C. I think I belong in A, and I'm going to work to make sure I did. And I did. In the 5th grade, I moved to 5B, and there were a few more white children, but still mostly black. But then I moved to 6A. That's where you and I met. 6A almost flipped. It was mostly white and mostly middle class and upper middle class children that were in those classes. I'm a new guy just coming in, so I was an interloper. They're looking at me like, how did you get in here? Where did you come from? Not just the white students, but more so the black students. And so I had issues. I had bullying issues with several other folks. I won't mention names, so.
Leland Academy only went through the 6th grade. And so my parents had a choice, and that was either put me on a bus to another town or go to the public school. And by that time, the public school had been 6 years, and the world hadn't collapsed and the sky hadn't fallen. And my dad was teaching, I think, at Leland High School at that time. And my mom had gotten to know a lot of the teachers, and I think she started to feel the teaching was in many ways better at public school than at some private schools. And so they just made the decision that they were going to send me to the public school, which turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me. So
Leland's public schools were not perfect, but it meant something when families like Pam Peppers came back. Things were changing. In 1976, Leland geared up for a classic small-town celebration of the 200th anniversary of the founding of America. The town renovated the old train station. Our congressman came to speak. There were 2 parades with wagon rides, ROTC units, a float celebrating Leland High's integrated championship football team. And the Cub Scouts marching down Main Street with my mother were both white and black. I marched in the junior high school band. We proudly wore blue and gold, the old colors of Breach High.
We thought that this is going to ultimately work out. We believed that we had done something good. We were going to change things and maybe begin to create Martin Luther King's beloved community. We were optimistic. And, you know, that many years after desegregation, we were pretty optimistic that it was going to work out.
And I want to recognize Doug's father, who in the audience right now, who we just saw on that clip. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your bravery back then. So there seemed to be a little bit of optimism there that you all were heading in the right direction. And, you know, in many ways, things have changed a lot. But there's still, you know, all of this resistance to progress and change. How are you processing where we are right now in Leland? And do you think there may have been other opportunities besides going through the court to achieve, you know, maybe even more sustainable change?
Well, that point in the film is definitely the high point of optimism, and when we discovered this footage, the beautiful color footage of the bicentennial celebrations in 1976, I was even struck myself seeing that footage, and we ended up finding 2 versions of it. Home movies that people had shot, and I was struck watching it, having been there as a kid, but then watching the film of just how integrated these crowds were, just how much interaction there was, and partly what was so striking about that was that we also had an image that somehow mysteriously is not in the film. The way these things happen is kind of crazy, but another image that we found at one point of a homecoming day parade in the town in 1964. Of the white high school's homecoming parade. And what you see in that static image in 1964, of course, is a portrait of middle America, apartheid, you know, absolute segregation, all white students in the parade, all white crowd on either side, except for 2 black maids that you can identify who are there escorting white children. And then literally in the back of the photograph, on the other side of the railroad tracks, there's a little group of African Americans who are watching this from a distance. And so the idea that this town had gone from that in 1964 to those images in 1976, in the passage of 12 years. Well, that's an astonishing thing. That really was a remarkable thing. And we wanted to show that because it really was this high point where one could look at that, particularly from a distance, and see, well, this is a community that maybe is about, the balance perhaps is about to tip. Maybe it's about to get easier. What my dad said, maybe there's real reason for optimism here. But the saddest part of this whole story, I think, as I see both of these films, is that that's not what happened. Is that even at that moment where the most progress seemed to have been made, and some openness and doors had opened, some hearts had opened in certain ways, that the choices that Americans began to make after that was that, this place that Dr. King wanted us to go to, this place that we inherently know is actually what America says it is, it's too hard to get to that place. And so that high point is also the moment that all of this begins to be abandoned. And what we've ended up with today is what I call separate but kind of equal. That's really what we have all across the country. We don't have separate but equal, the illusion, the always a myth, separate but equal, but because the old separate system was inherently unequal and by definition. But today what we have are in thousands of places all across America, and certainly in the South, but wherever there are lots of black kids and white kids in the same place, what you now have today is, one way or another, a system in which white kids and black kids go to schools that are somewhat similar, that there are, certainly not what black schools look like in Mississippi in the 1950s or 1940s, and so there's a kind of equality and separation, and a kind of collective decision that's enough, and I think that's a tragedy.
Sure. I was going to say, I don't think that's the case in Boston, that's separate but equal, or sort of equal, because the city of Boston only has 15% of the kids are white in the school system, and what has happened in Boston is you've had an incredible reduction in the school-age population. There were 94,000 kids going to public schools in 1974, and today, even though the city is slightly larger, there are 49,000. So people, if they could, move to the suburbs, and they stayed there, and they continue to do that. Their kids get to kindergarten or first grade, and if they can afford to move or they have opportunities, a lot of them move out. And the schools in the suburbs are much better. There's no question that they're much better than the schools in Boston, which are still really, really struggling. And then the other point I wanted to say is, I think that our film is completely not optimistic. It feels really a downer. And there are people who've come to, to raise issues about that, because although the school system really still struggling from that moment, there are things that happened in Boston that have changed because of that struggle. And so, it used to be that we had a elected school committee, which was all white because it was elected at large. And now we have a school committee that's appointed by the mayor. We have a very diverse city council. We have an Asian American mayor, and a lot of people. And although it's still a racially segregated city, it's not the city that it was in 1974.
Yeah, right. And NAACP, we had our conference in Boston, and had a really good experience there. So it is interesting. I know that Leland is much less white now than it was back then too, right?
Somewhat, though that whole part of Mississippi has depopulated dramatically, similar to what you described in Boston, in terms of who has departed. And so in Mississippi, it's primarily African American depopulation. But so you still have a town that is a very mixed town, but now African Americans are the majority in all but one of the school board seats, and the administration, the superintendent of the schools is an African American classmate of mine, and and those are the dimensions similar to what you just described in Boston, of where there was success of that. This community has been transformed in certain ways, but I think that all of that is within this constrained box. That where good has been accomplished. That's certainly the end message, I think, of our film is that these things were worth doing, even though they were painful and costly, and did not create the end results that some had imagined.
Yeah.
But they were still worth doing for all these other reasons. But I would say both in Boston and in Mississippi, the status quo is a completely unjust and unacceptable one.
Yeah, yeah. And we're going to invite the audience to ask questions too. So if you want to go ahead and start positioning yourself, you can. But another thing that was interesting in the last clip was we saw the beginning of within school segregation. So soon after we had integration, they introduced a testing system and divided them by groups, which seemed pretty unnecessary. And you know, these are tests that probably hadn't really been validated very well, tests that had likely the same types of racial biases that we see right now. And it also probably gave a lot of those white people who left the school a reason to say they made the right decision. You know, if they got their hands on that data, they're saying, well, all of the black students are slow, and you have these high-performing white children, and you're putting them with the low-performing black students. And so we do see how testing has been used in a lot of different cases. I'm sure in Boston, too, where they may introduce these tests, and you have higher testing scores in the suburbs and lower in the... And we don't really look deeply at the psychometrics of these tests, but we take them at face value. So, you know, these are, you know, just one observation that I made. But also, I think in both of the stories, you know, if we, if we look at it from the lens of the people who were fighting to make it happen, we do see a lot of success. You know, these districts are more diverse now, and it's not just black people going to white schools. And that was never the objective of any of the black people that were talking, just to be close to white schools. They just wanted a quality education, and an education that accepted everyone. So we see more acceptance of diverse abilities. We see more acceptance of the LGBTQ plus population. So I think that opened up the door to a more progressive type of environment that we see right now. Any response before we go to the questions from the audience?
I think that's definitely true. That is a definite plus in Boston, that it's opened up. The whole mindset in the school system is completely different. And so it's much more accepting. There's not you can't say that a kid can't go to that school because they're white or Latino. That's not the way the system works. The curriculum's different, hugely different in terms of who the faculty, staff, administrators are. So all of that has upended in a really, really positive way.
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to say that, you know, Leland had this alphabet system. I grew up in upstate New York. In my high school, we had the alphabet system where children were categorized, and guidance counselors would always try to push you into a letter grade that was below the A.
But that's I'm not at all surprised. But that speaks to one of the insidious nature of white supremacy, and the incredibly clever ability of white supremacy to find its way around the obstacles and the resistors who stand up against it. And so that's one reason why we, in the film, in that clip, the person who best explained the ability grouping system was an African-American teacher who explained what we were doing and didn't at all see it as a racist thing, because in fact, at that point in time, it was sort of the newest, and it was considered an innovative educational approach all across the country. But what's fascinating is that when I was a kid, I can remember that there was discussion at times. By the time I was more in high school, there was some discussion about, well, hey, maybe this is actually racist. And of course, those achievement tests we were taking were the Iowa Basic Test of Achievement. You know, so you have this standardized test based on the whitest large state in America. You know, so I mean, it's pretty obvious what's going to happen there. But there was some discussion of, well, maybe this is actually a subliminal racist thing, you know, a hidden racist thing. But the educators who were involved, including my mom and Mrs. Richardson, who's them, very sincerely, you know, would say, no, that's not what it was. This was an educational approach. However, and this is not in the film, not long ago, found my way into some records of a lawyer who was working with the lawyers who were defending segregation in Mississippi at that time. And there's an exchange between these lawyers back in the late 1960s in which, after they've clearly lost, the Supreme Court has issued this last ruling that says, it's over, you have to desegregate these schools. And one of the responses in these private conversations between the lawyers is one of them says, don't worry, there's this ability grouping thing, and you tell your local school board to just start using ability grouping, and you'll be able to have segregation within integration. And so it was both. It was both a white supremacist conspiracy and an honest thing by these educators who didn't quite realize that's what was happening. And that's the insidious nature of white supremacy in a society like the one that we live in.
Wow, that was fascinating. We'll start with you, and you can start off by saying your name and ask your question.
My name is Stephen Lincoln Spitz. I was born in Illinois on February 12th. That's why my parents gave me the middle name of Lincoln. So you get where I'm coming from, literally and figuratively. I wound up becoming a civil rights lawyer, and from 1973 to 1978, I was involved with school desegregation. And I had 3 cases in Mississippi. And you're right on the point about the ability grouping, and I'll just give you an example of what I encountered. There were requirements that you have Mississippi history in high school. We noticed that the black students were in a course called vocational social studies. So when I would sit down with the school board and the superintendent and say, what is vocational social studies? Isn't this Mississippi history? And they would have to admit, yes. It was a way of segregating the students within the schools. Now, I do have a bone to pick, sir, with what your generalization that school integration is a failure. I would say more accurately, it would be described as a mixed bag. It depends upon the locality. It depends upon what kind of enforcement there was. Freedom of choice is not an integration plan. That never worked. As you show in the film, I mean, that doesn't work. However, there are a lot of, I live in Virginia now. Probably you've all seen Remember the Titans with Denzel Washington. That was 1971 in Alexandria, Virginia, which is near where I live. What they did is create one high school for all the kids in Alexandria. And that was what happened in 1971. So here we have 52 years later, it's still one high school. So, anybody who lives in Alexandria who's going to public school is going to that one high school. Obviously, that's a lot better way to get integration than to be able to maintain 2 separate high schools and expect somehow that's going to be integrated. At any rate, I congratulate you all for doing these films. I think it's obviously very important to talk about this and to think about it. And I will say one more thing if I can. In 1973, I got a complaint across my desk, and it was from a guy named Fred Phelps. That name's probably familiar to some people. He later became head of the Westboro Baptist Church. At the time, Fred Phelps was a civil rights lawyer. The complaint alleged that the Topeka, Kansas public schools were racially segregated and the facilities were unequal. My first reaction was, didn't this guy hear of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas? Well, what happened was nothing in Topeka, Kansas, because there was no follow-through. This whole integration thing depended upon enforcement and implementation. And, it's been very uneven.
Yeah, Thank you, thank you. Anyone want to respond before we get to?
Well, I just would say that, since it's my bone that's being picked, or your bone that's being picked, I don't disagree with anybody you said. My point when I say that we have to accept that public school integration is a failure, another way of saying that is that public school desegregation, the dismantling of a legally required system of segregation, has been successfully achieved. It's no longer the law in Mississippi or anywhere else in America that black children be injured by the state in the way that it operates public schools. And that was the law for the longest time. And so, yes, we've successfully ended that version of segregation. And there are examples of what one could call successful integration in many places in America. They are overwhelmingly in places where the black population is quite small. Now, Americans have made some progress in terms of where, in those days, if the black population was greater than 10%. Sociologists have nailed these numbers down pretty precisely. But if the black population was more than 10%, then almost all white families could not stand that and would not participate in public schools. That number has now risen to more like 30%. And so that's a sign of real, growing tolerance. That's still a sign of a nation in which we're unable to operate integrated public schools in a successful way. And so that's what I mean by the failure. Yes, lots of progress has been made, and there are good examples to identify in many places, and enforcement is critical and a failure for the most part. But the real ultimate purpose, the thing that Dr. King asked us to dream toward in 1963 in terms of schools and the ending of segregation, has been a failure.
Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. My name is Gerard Allen. I was born in Leland, Mississippi.
Wow.
I lived there for about 3 hours until my mother and father took me home to Greenville.
That's close enough.
So everything, I am so connected to both. My teaching career started in Boston. I did a parochial school, and then I worked in public schools. But to your point, Doug, so much of my life, as it was described, in elementary, we did not use letters, we used numbers. And first grade was segregated schools. Second grade was freedom of choice. And so I still went to a all-black school, not predominantly black, all-black school. Third grade was integration. And I'd been in the one class in first grade, the one class in second grade, and in third grade, when my mother took me to the school, I just automatically walked to the one classroom. And they posted names outside, and my name wasn't there. And I knew, as you said, as the person said in the film, something's not right. I was in the 2 class. I had the same teacher that I had the previous year, who was a great teacher. And one day, I got an opportunity to go to the bathroom, and I said, I gotta see what's happening in that one class. And the one class was all white. And the 2 class was about 5 or 6 black kids. And the 3 class was, on down. So, but my point, what I wanted to say was that I get your point that says integration was a failure. So I am an educator. I've been for 31 years. But what I have seen, what I've seen is that we have done, as you say, the resegregation. It is socioeconomic. It is also ability grouping, because we test kids to go to certain schools. But how do we sort of move back? Because when you said that moment in '76 was like the pinnacle, and then after that we started to decline, that's true. Because Greenville I graduated in 1981. We were probably 60-40, black to white. It is now predominantly, you could basically say it's all black. And the whites left to go to Washington School and to Greenville Christian and St. Joe. So how do we, or is it even possible that we go back to those moments where we do have some balance of black and white students in our schools, to say that it wasn't a complete failure, but it provided a space and an opportunity for us to learn. And then how do we now swing the pendulum back the other way? Not just in Mississippi, but also in Boston.
All right, thank you.
I'll take a quick first shot at that. One, it's great that you're here, and you know the Greenville is the town 7 miles away from Leland, so but a much larger place. But the statistics you just cited of when you graduated in 1981 and I graduated from high school in 1982, so we're very similar experiences. That it was 60-40 in your high school senior year, and now the same school is essentially 100% African American. Very telling statistic. But your town, Greenville, was actually written about in a widely read publication in the early 1970s as the model town for all of America, for where Greenville wasn't named. It was treated as this anonymous location, but it was this profile of the community that did things right and had made the hard decisions and had succeeded at integration, the southern town that had succeeded. And that place that was held up as that exemplar is now a place where we've had a complete resegregation. Now, the students in Greenville attend a much better resourced all-black school than the all-black school their grandparents attended in the same town. So that's a progress of a sort. That's the kind of equal that I mean. And of course, just as in the story we tell in The Harvest, there are many good things that happen, many openings that occurred that are positive dimensions of it. But where we go from now, how do we get back on the right kind of track, I think is, that's the $100 million Donald Trump or not question, isn't it? Not to be political, but I mean, right now, the issue on the table is whether public schools will survive in our society at all, I would say. Now, that's opening up a whole other topic, but I think that there has to be a much more serious embrace by Americans of the importance of public schools as a basal element of the structure of our society, first and foremost. And secondly, a recognition that if we want to be the place that we say we want it to be, we have to succeed in a bigger way at these things than white people in particular have been willing to attempt for the most part.
So we want to take this opportunity now to just include some questions from our online viewers. So this question comes to us from Sean, who's on YouTube, and it's for Cindy and Sharon. He wants to know about your interview process and how you collected narratives when you were making the film. He said, did you have a solid story outline prior to gathering your interviews, or was it for you an organic process where certain interviews led to new directions in story narrative?
Well, when we pitched the idea to American Experience, we had to come up with some kind of outline. So yes, there was an outline to start out with, but we probably interviewed, I don't know, somewhere between 200 and 250 people. And the stories prior to shooting, yes, we didn't film those interviews. So we interviewed a lot of people, police officers, teachers, principals, administrators, and shape the story from that. And some of the names we pulled out of yearbooks and newspaper articles. There were a few activists from the time who led us to other interviewees, other possible interviews. So it was a combination of having an idea and then that idea being shaped by the people we spoke to.
And shaped by the stories that they told us, their personal stories.
Thank you. My name is Michelle, and I graduated high school in 1988, and I grew up maybe in a bubble in Columbia, Maryland. That was a planned city that was designed for racial, economic, and social integration. So I recently heard somewhere, probably on NPR, that the 80s was the height of integration for schools. And I was floored. I figured, kind of like the gentleman before me said that, you know, we thought we had got there. I thought it would keep going. And so that's part of the reason why I'm here this evening. Thank you for making these films. It gave me an opportunity to talk to my parents about the decisions they made about the schools where my sister and I attended. But I really am curious about why you made these films now and what you hope they will accomplish.
Well, we talked a little bit at the beginning about why we made them now. I think, I mean, the story in Boston is so painful, and it never really reached a high point. There was never a moment of like we're making progress because it was so violent. And the few people, and there were people who really wanted to make it work. The few people who wanted to make it work, some of them gave up. Some of them, one of them was in our film, and he eventually, after 5 or 6 years, pulled his kids out of school and moved to the Cape. So I think that the people who tried got despondent. Many people just, you know, so there was no high point in Boston. I would say there never was a. And I think that for in Boston, I think that the experience of the efforts to desegregate the schools have really shaped the schools this day, and so in ways that the system is still grappling with. And the gratifying thing for us is that we had this wonderful screening with the superintendent of public schools, and the mayor came when it was broadcast, and she said that she has taken our film to the history department. It's going to be introduced and worked into the curriculum from grades 6 through 12, and that they are looking at it as a way to rethink about what they're doing in Boston. So that's very gratifying. Yeah.
Yeah, and one observation is that there was legally enforced busing during the peak of integration, or of what we consider integration. So we have to think about it that way too. A lot of people are being forced to go to school with other people, and then the federal government stopped enforcing that, and then we gradually saw what we saw right now. Second point I'll make is that if we decenter whiteness, schools are more integrated now. They have less white students in schools with students of color, but overall integration, you know, there's many different races, many different cultures, many different other types of characteristics. So we are more integrated now. We just don't have the kind of integration as we defined it back then.
I'd also say that in terms of our film, that I mean, part of it, and I mean, the film is set up this way, and it's a very, very personal story for me, and so the film, in some respects, is this personal journey of somebody who has spent a career writing about and exploring questions related to race, and then, okay, I'm going to go back to my hometown and try to understand what happened or what didn't happen. And so in that sense, very, very personal story. But it also, and I think, again, both films would fit into this, the failure of things to turn out the way that people of goodwill thought they might turn out or hoped they would turn out has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the fact that, you know, all the people who in 1972, whether in Boston or in Mississippi, all the white people who were saying, well, I don't want my kids to go to the public schools because they're too dangerous and violent, or there's too much chaos around all of that. Well, the fact that somehow, mysteriously, it turns out that the schools didn't really successfully integrate in the people were imagining them, became a proof of those ideas in the minds of so many Americans. It became a kind of little discussed article of faith among all kinds of Americans that, yeah, you know, for some reason that public school stuff just doesn't work out. You know, it's a little like saying that, you know, Croatians and Serbians can never live in the same place, you know. Well, yes, they can, you know, and black Americans and white Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans can go to the same schools. But this idea, this infectious white supremacist notion, race supremacist notion of that this just can't be accomplished in a society like ours takes root. And we have to talk about these stories to see that, one, the level of struggle that it takes to challenge those ideas at all, but also that even in the midst of what I would call failures, there are still hopeful things that happen and successful things that happen. So I think that's why we need these stories.
I would just counter with one thing, is that I think that's true. In Boston, in parts of Boston, the very extreme people really did make that hard for people to lean into integration. And Boston, you've got to remember at this time, South Boston was a South Boston of Whitey Bulger, a gangster. If you were a white parent and you put your kid on that bus from South Boston, if you went against your community, your kid, people got threats to the violence against their kids. And so it really, there was this culture of violence that made it very hard for some people to stick it out, because even people who didn't want, there were people, I think, in South Boston who were against integration, but were law-abiding, who would feel like, I'm putting my kid on the bus because I'm a law-abiding person, and that's the law. It's a law that you do that. And then there are definitely instances where grandmothers would be called up and say, if you put the kid on the bus tomorrow, Whitey's guys are going to go after you. And so I think it really poisoned the well.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't talked much about the lack of the political will of the mayor in Boston and other political figures. I mean, there was never this sort of effort to explain that, there's a court case, illegal things have been happening, our schools have to change and improve, Black people's lives have to get better, this is good for the whole community. There was never this effort to get the buy-in with the whole community. It was always set up again to us and them, and they want our stuff, and I think that was a huge failure in Boston.
Yeah. So I'm getting the signal, so we have to wrap up soon. So we'll take these two last questions. I'm going to have you all ask your question, and one after the other, and then give the panelists time to respond to both of your questions.
Wonderful. My name is Roy, and my question is, are freedom schools or Strike City the answer to what we're seeing right now with the refusal to teach the history of marginalized communities, whether that be Black, Latino, LGBTQ, or whatever else? In other words, we have so much wealth in this country. Could we just create schools in these places that are refusing to teach this so that we can teach it?
Excellent question. Thank you.
My question's kind of similar. I'm Isabella. I'm a sociology doctoral student at George Mason University. And I couldn't help during these two videos to notice some parallel situations with the history and the current events. And this quote that teacher had, if my behavior kept them from learning, then I wanted to do something about my behavior. And I was wondering if there were any lessons that you thought could be learned from these historical events, and how can we use them to address our current events?
So we have a minute left. So if you could answer both of the questions and give your final comment in a few seconds or less.
Well, I'll try. I think that there is no one answer to any of these things, except that we can do better. Human beings can do better. Human beings are, we are compulsively inclined to do bad things, but we're also compulsively or accidentally inclined to do good things. And a lot of good things were attempted in all of this, a lot of good things were accomplished, but so much more can be done. And if we're serious about becoming the society that we say we already are oftentimes, or that we aspire to be, then all Americans, whether we're progressive-minded or conservative or whatever, have some obligation at this moment in time to ask themselves some very honest questions. If you are a upper middle class white person who chose not to put your children in public schools, wherever that may have been, and you said that the reason that you made that choice was because the public schools didn't seem to be high enough quality, or you were concerned about chaos or danger or some sort, well, maybe so, but did you really sit down and ask yourself honestly a series of questions about whether that's the reality that your children would face? And then if you decided that I still can't send my children to that school, did you then say, well, what can I do then about those issues that were the concern that stopped me from doing that thing? And did you do those things? And almost everyone will say they did the first part of that, that they asked those questions, but almost no one says that they did the second part. And that's what we all have to do. That's what we all have to. But the specific answers are different in every place, though they share many things. And the most common thing is that we have to be honest about the degree to which we have failed at so much of this, the danger that poses to all of us and our children and grandchildren, and we have to re-engage in that in a meaningful way, like my mom did, who's the quote that you quoted about the teacher saying, "I've got to change my own behavior." Well, that was my mother's own self-awareness that made her able to see that.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I like this idea of, that was brought up about starting freedom schools, like parallel schools, or maybe they would be Saturday schools, and teaching some of this history that now apparently, we don't want to teach. I don't think we can wait for white people to decide that, they're going to have this change of consciousness and invest in public schools. I think we need to just improve the schools for the children that are there and educate them. And I thought you got a good point that they are diverse. And if there's not white people there, then there's not white people there.
I don't know if I have a big concluding thought other than we showed the film in Provincetown, and I was scared because it was a white audience coming to look at it, and there were a group of 4 white women from South Boston sitting in front of me, and they were very angry about segregation, desegregation, and what it did to their schools, and losing their schools, and all the rest of it. And they sat and watched the film, and 2 things really struck me. Was one, they didn't know the story. They didn't know the prior story about why this happened. They didn't know why black kids were being bused to South Boston, and that was really eye-opening to them. And then the other thing was that one of them came up to me afterwards and said, "I want you to know that I had my first kiss in South Boston High School, was with a black girl, and it changed my life." And so there was just a lot of things that could have happened that didn't happen. A lot of possibility. But anyway, I'm hoping that the films allow people to understand the history in a new way and open people's eyes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'm married to a black woman, and kissing the black girl will change your life. So. So thank you all so much for your contribution to this discussion. The films are absolutely amazing. And thank you to American Experience, our conveners. And sorry we went over a little bit. You forgive us? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to our hosts, Cameo and Susan. But let's give the panel one round of applause.
Thank you to our panel once again for joining us here and making the trip here. It was wonderful, challenging, thoughtful, lots to think about. If you haven't seen the full films yet, they are available to stream for free on our website at pbs.org/American Experience, on the PBS app, and on YouTube where you're watching right now. So please do stream. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think, tell a friend, and thank you so much again for being part of this wonderful conversation. Thank you, have a great night.